Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World. This is Chapter 7. Oh, gosh, this is a long unit. This is Chapter 7 of Unit 1. We're going to look at today what is going on in Africa. So we're going to kind of cover different African civilizations in today's video, especially looking at North Africa with the Almohad and Almoravid and Almohad empires, but also going down to Sub-Saharan Africa, looking at the Hausa kingdoms, looking at Bantu migration, looking at Ethiopia, looking at Great Zimbabwe, a bunch of different places. So bell work on the screen, obviously. Let's get started. Oh my God. So today we're going to look at different civilizations across Africa. And obviously, I'm fairly confident that you watching understand that Africa is not a single country. It is a giant continent. It is, I believe, the second largest continent after Asia. And these are kind of just some basic terminology in terms of kind of geography when it comes to Africa. As we're going to see today, Africa is extremely diverse, and we'll talk about why that is later on in just a second. But these are the different regions that we typically refer to when we're talking about Africa, at least in a geographic and political sense. So we're going to begin today by looking at North Africa, a little bit of West Africa, but we have a whole day for that when we talk about Unit 2. And we have East Africa down here, Southern Africa, there's South Africa, the country of South Africa, Central Africa. But generally, today we're going to kind of think about this distinction between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So the Saharan Desert, roughly right here, Sub-Saharan Africa, everything below that. Kind of simple. So the lesson objective today is the same, basically, as the Americas. It's the same, basically, as everywhere, as we've been talking about so far. But it's explain how and why states in Africa developed and changed over time. So first, you have to identify what states you're talking about, what empires, what countries you're talking about, then talk about how they're coming into being and why they changed. All right. So first and foremost, let's begin by looking at North Africa. We're going to look generally at a group of people referred to as the Saharan peoples. And this is going to include Arabs, it includes people from Egypt, it includes a group we are going to talk about more in just a second, the Berbers. So North Africa is kind of geographically unique from the rest of Africa insofar as it is going to largely be dominated by the Saharan Desert. The Saharan Desert, as you might be well aware, is the largest desert in the world. And it is covering an extremely diverse allotment of countries. For example, it stretches from Morocco in the west all the way to Egypt in the east. It's a very big desert that is largely going to be populated mostly in the north by the Atlantic Ocean, by the Mediterranean Sea. There are, of course, oases, as we saw with the Arabian Desert. There are oases which allow for inner Saharan communities. But something that's actually kind of notable about the Saharan Desert is that it is largely growing. It is the result of a natural process known as desertification. And desertification, I'm saying that weird, desertification. I'm not saying it correctly, but this is AP World History with your favorite teacher, man who can't pronounce things correctly. But anyway, desertification is going to be something that does impact the region of North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa as well. The Saharan Desert didn't used to be so massive. It is largely the result of changes like climate change going back to the time of the Romans. The Saharan Desert used to be a large area of grasslands and domesticated animals, things like horses. So largely, many of these societies are going to have to adapt to the desertification process. And then kind of just some more technical terminology before we look at the groups of people that will settle North Africa. We do have kind of a transition zone, if you will, of the Saharan desert and a region called the Sahel, which essentially is the transition between the desert, the Saharan desert, and the more lush, comparatively, savanna, the African savanna that is largely sub-Saharan Africa, at least the border of that. So the natural environment of the Saharan desert is going to see that people will have to adapt to limited water resources, especially as desertification grows more prominent. And we do see that different groups of people, they're going to have different approaches. So one of the kind of biggest groups of people on the Saharan desert are mostly going to be nomadic societies. And we'll look at those specific societies in a second. But one way that these nomadic societies, including the Berbers, as we'll talk about in a second, how they're going to adapt to their natural environment is through trade, is through the development of a trading system that we historians refer to as the the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. And this actually has origins back in the classical period, back during the time of the Romans and the Greeks and the Phoenicians. The Trans-Saharan trade largely was this trade network across the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So we do largely have a trading network that is mostly confined just to the north right here. And that's largely because we don't really have a perfect animal, you could say, to get further inland, further into the interior, down to sub-Saharan Africa. So this trading network is going to expand, is going to reach the sub-Saharan Africa kingdoms of places like Ghana and Mali that we'll talk about more in Unit 2. We are going to see that eventually by around 700 CE, by around the time of the spread of Islam, of the spread of the Umayyad Caliphate, of the Abbasid, of the Fatimid dynasty as well, that we do see this expansion of the sub-Saharan trade network, not just into because of its incorporation into Eurasian trade networks, but also because we have the ability to go further and further south across the Saharan desert. And probably the best explanation for why that is the introduction of a new domesticated animal, everyone's favorite dromedary. What are they called? I don't know. I'm not a scientist. Everyone's favorite animal, the camel. The camel, of course, as you know, is adaptable to a dry environment like the Saharan, because they can go miles and miles without water. And we do see that there is places that will try and capitalize on this trans-Saharan trade, these oases kingdoms that we don't really talk about all that much, but we do and will talk about places like Marrakesh today, places like Timbuktu later on, places like Kano as well. And largely these nomadic groups of people, they are going to adopt pastoral, nomadic existences, but they're also engaged in trade, as we've been seeing. They are going to engage in trade. We do see primarily some of these exports and imports. They include things like salt and gold, palm oil. That's going to be a pretty big deal, well, really throughout world history, as we will see. But also, of course, we do see the involvement of this Islamic slave trade. We do see slaves being exchanged, especially from West Africa, as things pick up in this trade network. But we will talk about the Trans-Saharan trade a bit more. What is important for today, though, is that kingdoms will emerge to capitalize on this very important trade network. We are seeing that there are nomadic societies that are facilitating or allowing for this trade to happen by being the merchants. But there are going to be sedentary civilizations that will take over, that will capitalize on this trade, not only inland, but also this kind of western portion of the Mediterranean Sea trade. So let's look specifically at these groups of people. We're going to look first at the nomads, then we'll look at the sedentary civilizations. And largely North Africa, there are these are very broad over generalizations, of course, but North Africa largely is going to be influenced by two distinct ethnic cultures. We have Arabic society, mostly from the Arabian Peninsula, that traveled to North Africa as a result of the rise of Islam and Islamic traders, but also a group of people we refer to as the Berbers. The Berbers are a distinct ethnicity in North Africa, and they are going to be a mix of both sedentary and nomadic civilizations. The Berbers will settle along oases within the interior of North Africa, but also along the coast as well. Really, we see a difference though between how these groups of people will develop. Nomadic groups of Berbers, they're largely going to be, for example, more receptive to Islam because their major trading partners way back east, they're Muslims. So largely nomadic groups, nomadic Berbers, they're going to adopt Islam a lot quicker than more sedentary Berbers. Berbers who live along the coast especially, they have strong connections with Christianity as a result of all this trade with the remains of the Roman Empire. So really, these are going to be the last parts of North Africa to adopt Islam. And largely, they're going to adopt Islam thanks to outside invaders, thanks to invaders like the Umayyad Caliphate, thanks to contact with the Abbasid Caliphate. So really, we do see a distinction between how societies are forming. Nomadic groups are more susceptible to Islam, sedentary groups less susceptible, but will eventually come into the Islamic world thanks to Islamic conquest. But we're also going to see that the culture of North Africa is going to undergo a process known as Arabization. And Arabization is going to be a process much like Hellenization, much like, what was the other one? Much like Sinification. We are going to see the adoption of Arabic as a language, Arabic script as a writing system in North Africa, largely North African script prior to the introduction of Arabic. It was more similar to Phoenician, more similar to what would become, say, the Latin alphabet. But thanks to the dominance of Islamic merchants, thanks to the dominance of Islamic empires that we'll talk about in a second, we do see that Arabization is occurring, that is transforming the culture of North Africa. And that's happening linguistically, but it's also happening religiously as well. As you can imagine, the rise of Muslim traders, the rise of Muslim empires, that's leading to the diffusion or spread of Islam. And Islam is going to be a very important way that kingdoms rise in North Africa. That's how they base their legal and political system off of ideas of Islam and Sharia. So let's look at these sedentary societies. The nomadic ones, largely engaging in trade, largely engaging in trans-Saharan trade. But let's look at two big North African empires. And firstly, before we even begin, we have to define this specific region of North Africa, this area between what is today Morocco all the way to Libya. This is an area known as the Maghreb. And the Maghreb is basically northwestern Africa. And this is going to be the site, actually, of one of our first Berber sedentary kingdoms, and that is going to be the Almoravid dynasty. And the Almoravid, they're going to be initially a group of Berbers who will eventually convert to Islam, and they are going to unify this region of North Africa and a bit of Spain after the decline of the Umayyad Caliphate. As the Abbasid Caliphate is also declining, we do see that a unifying political empire does exist here. So the fragmentation of earlier Islamic empires is allowing for another dynasty to emerge to unite this culturally and ethnically similar part of Africa together. Eventually, we do see that the Almoravids, they are going to invade the Iberian Peninsula after the Cordoba Caliphate collapses. They are going to impose kind of this idea of Islamization, where we are seeing the spread of Islam into the Iberian Peninsula. And the Almoravid, they are significant, and we're thinking about this idea of maintaining power and trade over time, thanks to their kind of position as an endpoint of the Trans-Saharan trade network, of an endpoint of the Mediterranean Sea network. So they are the western portion of the Mediterranean Sea trade network. They're the western and northern portion of the Trans-Saharan trade network. So they're able to capitalize on this trading empire thanks to their position geographically. And we are going to see the emergence of the kind of cultural and economic and political capital of Northwest Africa in the city of Marrakesh. It's pronounced and spelled a whole bunch of different ways, but this is one way to spell it. Marrakesh is going to be the political center, the economic center of the Almoravid Empire, and as we'll see in a second, the Almohad Empire as well. But it is yet again an example of how states are forming. They are forming thanks to kind of power vacuums that exist, and they are going to maintain their political power by establishing cities like Marrakesh, for example. Marrakesh is going to be a very important economic center in Northwest Africa. Eventually, the Almoravid Empire collapses. There's internal divisions, and we have another empire form. It's the Almohad Caliphate, and they are going to kind of build upon the legacy of the Almoravid dynasty, insofar as they will conquer many of the same territories. They will also use Marrakesh as a political and economic center. There will be a bit of an Islamic golden age in this region of the world. Thanks to all of this trade coming in, thanks to all these kings and caliphs promoting culture. Eventually, they are going to kind of disintegrate, at least in terms of their Spanish holdings, thanks to an event known as the Reconquista. The Reconquista, as we will talk about in much greater detail later, it's a series of conflicts between the Christian northern kings of the Iberian Peninsula looking to expel the Muslims from Spain. So I would show this in class. It's a short little video about the just a very brief history of the city of Marrakesh under the Almoravid and the Almohad empires. Shut up. So how is geography impacting societies in North Africa? Think not only nomadic groups, but think about those sedentary civilizations. How are they creating political and economic power in North Africa? All right, so we looked at Saharan Africa. Let's look below the Saharan Desert. And as we're about to see, this is a very generalized definition of Sub-Saharan Africa because it's a huge geographic region filled with geographic and cultural diversity. But we do see some general trends that do apply to many Sub-Saharan African societies. But as usual, let's look at geography and how that is impacting culture and political developments. Well, as we've talked about with India, Sub-Saharan Africa is extremely geographically and culturally diverse. We do have kind of three distinct regions of Sub-Saharan Africa. There's the savanna, kind of that borderland between the Saharan and the center of Africa, which is largely going to be tropical jungles. I guess all jungles are tropical, or are they? Tropical kind of forests in the center of Africa. And then as you get closer and closer to Antarctica, to the south of Africa, you do have more arid kind of grasslands return. But as a result of this extremely diverse geography, and this is a general trend in world history and what you've probably talked about in human geography, is that the diversity geographically speaking, is going to lead to diverse cultures and societies and political entities across Sub-Saharan Africa. And indeed, Sub-Saharan Africa is an extremely diverse place. In terms of linguistic diversity, there's almost 2,000 different languages across sub-Saharan Africa, native languages, that is. And this is extremely diverse, of course. And how can we explain that? Well, largely because of geographic isolation. But we also kind of have some degree of cultural similarity between many of these geographic regions of sub-Saharan Africa. And it goes into kind of a historic anthropological concept that people refer to as great and small traditions. A great tradition is largely going to be a cultural legacy that is defined by a single political power and a written language. So a great tradition, an example of that could be Rome, for example. Rome has a clear political entity and it has a written language, it has Latin. Whereas a small tradition, that is more kind of a culturally distinct culture and tradition, but it isn't really defined by a single unified empire. It isn't defined by a shared language. There are different kind of languages that comprise these cultures. There are different political entities that have similar cultural backgrounds. And that's largely what we are going to see in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't see a single unifying empire that has a unified culture. And we certainly don't see any linguistic similarity between these different societies, but we do see some shared cultural practices. So there are some cultural similarities across sub-Saharan Africa, as we will see in a second. And largely, we explain this cultural similarity for two things. For one thing, there is going to be complex trade networks that do exist, as we will see in a second, but we also do see the presence of migration. Migration is going to be a major reason why we have we have a degree of cultural similarity across sub-Saharan Africa. And some of these cultural similarities, they include a diverse, different array of things. For one thing, we do see that many sub-Saharan African societies, they will share similar agricultural practices. They will share ironworking, they will share the creation of iron plows, iron tools, but they also are planting similar crops. They are going to have, in many cases, rice and yams, the heavy use of cattle and goats. Those are also very common as you get throughout sub-Saharan Africa. We also see similar ideas of culture and religion as well. It's not universal, but we do see some basic similarities. We do see generally that sub-Saharan African traditions are animistic, meaning there are multiple gods, and these gods take on inanimate objects and roles. We see kind of practices that involve similar rituals, dancing and music are very important. In many sub-Saharan African cultures, we see the use of ceremonial masks. We also sometimes see the role of women in these ceremonies. We do see that despite differences in language, despite differences in political structures, that there are some basic cultural and religious practices that are similar. But we also see that many sub-Saharan African societies are going to be so distinct and transformed so much because of this idea of syncretism, the idea of blending different religious and cultural practices together to make something unique. And that's especially going to become complicated once we get the introduction of Islam into places like West Africa, into places like Southeast Africa. So syncretism is going to be a major kind of component of many sub-Saharan African societies. And actually, as we'll see when we talk about the African diaspora with African societies going to the New World, thanks to the transatlantic slave trade, we do see that this tradition of cultural syncretism and these practices, they will carry over to the New World when we see the creation of distinct Afro-American societies. So we'll talk about that more in Unit 4, actually. But we're also going to see that there are some similarities in political practices as well. We do see that generally there's kind of a mix between non-hierarchical and monarchical systems. The monarch generally in sub-Saharan Africa serves a kind of obviously political purpose, but a religious one as well. The monarch isn't necessarily a god, especially in more Islamic influenced societies, but there is this notion across sub-Saharan societies of what we refer to as the royal cult. And this isn't worship of a king as a god, but more so that the king is a religious figure who provides a model for how people are supposed to live and work. So Islamic kings, especially in West Africa, they're going to be heavily interested in maintaining an Islamic lifestyle as a moral code, as a moral standard for different people within their empires, for their citizens, for their subjects, rather. So monarchs do have this kind of moral and cultural obligation to be leaders as moral examples. But we also see generally that there is going to be a big importance on family and clan loyalty, especially as you get into the interior of Africa. Clan and family loyalty are extremely important in sub-Saharan African societies. And many of these communities, many of these smaller communities, especially many of these royal dynasties, they are going to form on the basis of who is a part of your family. So family is very important politically and socially as well as a form of organization. But it's extremely generalizing and overviewing to kind of characterize sub-Saharan Africa in such broad terms, because some places have more kind of set hierarchies, some places are going to have less hierarchy, be what we call stateless societies, meaning there's a lack of a single unified state or political structure. We don't really have state societies in the interior of Africa. There's a lot of geographic and cultural and political isolation. And mostly these societies are going to be more based on family and local community traditions. And this idea of not everywhere having the same hierarchy, that's expressed in gender as well. We do see some matrilineal societies in sub-Saharan Africa where women have a prominent social and cultural role, if not political in some places. So let's look at kind of examples of how sub-Saharan culture is going to spread and how that results in new societies and new societal practices. And one of the kind of most significant of these ways that culture spreads, these ways that societies develop and share very, very many similarities. And one of such example, as I've been building up to, is the Bantu migrations. And this is something that I see a lot of on AP practice tests and on College Board as well. It's this idea of the Bantu migrations. The Bantu are a group, an ethnic/linguistic group that probably have their origins over here in West Africa, in what is today roughly Nigeria or so. We do see that the Bantu, for a variety of reasons, probably because of climate change or political divisions, we will see that there will be a migration over a very long time period, over about a 2,000-year time period, of different groups of Bantu speakers moving across sub-Saharan Africa. And with them, they are going to spread a lot of different ideas that will become the basis for many sub-Saharan African societies. So for one thing, we do see the spread of metalworking, of ironworking, especially if you ever see Bantu migration, think the spread of agriculture and ironworking. Just as a hint. So we do see the spread or the diffusion of metalworking from West Africa into sub-Saharan African society. So there is knowledge of metalworking, and we see that best expressed in archaeological evidence. We see iron-tipped plows, we see kind of similar agricultural produce being produced or being grown in these sub-Saharan societies. So we do see similar agricultural practices that will spread as a result of these migrations. And these migrations most likely occur because of climate change, especially because of this idea of desertification. It threatens these sub-Saharan savanna-based societies, sometimes referred to generally as the Sudan, not to be confused with the country of Sudan. But we do see, because of the Bantu migration, that several kind of societies will form throughout sub-Saharan Africa, thanks to kind of the model of the Bantu. The Bantu are technologically diffusing things like agricultural practices, like ironworking, but also linguistically as well and culturally as well. Bantu is going to be the basis of many sub-Saharan African languages. So different societies are going to kind of model themselves off of the ethnic, linguistic, and technological influence of these Bantu migrants. But really quickly, let's return to West Africa and look at another way that societies are forming, and that is largely through trade. So the Hausa people are a group, an ethnic group that largely exists in what is today Nigeria. And they are eventually going to form several kingdoms in this region of West Africa. And there is going to be the creation of a kind of semi-feudalistic, loose confederacy of different independent kingdoms that technically have similar culture, that have a similar kind of economic outlook. They do oftentimes fight with each other, but it is a loose confederacy of kingdoms that will form, but it's largely going to form on the basis of trade. We do see that the Hausa kingdoms, that's going to be kind of the southern end of the Trans-Saharan trade network. We do see especially kind of the trading of leather, of salt, and grain. There's going to be a lot of cows in this region, providing kind of high-class leather. We're seeing salt, of course. That's a major product of West Africa. But as a result of this trade, we're not only going to see a political empire forming, or I should say a political civilization emerging, but we also see that Islam will diffuse into this region thanks to trans-Saharan trade. And many times, as we kind of overviewed earlier, religion oftentimes takes on a syncretic position in society. We do see that many African traditions in West Africa, they're going to blend themselves with Islamic tradition. So we do see kind of this religious syncretism be the basis of many kingdoms in West Africa. But we also see, because of this trade, that we do have important city-states emerging. One of the most important and biggest in this region of West Africa at the time is the city of Kano. And we'll talk about Mali a bit more later on, and Mansa Musa, who was so rich that he broke the world economy, literally, no joke. But we see already that there are Islamic-styled kingdoms that do form in West Africa that make a profit off of the trans-Saharan trade. And speaking of trade and the spread of Islam, let's turn our attention now to a region of West Africa called the Swahili Coast. The Swahili Coast essentially is this region of West Africa that borders the Indian Ocean that is going to see a significant interaction with the Islamic world. And it's referred to as the Swahili Coast because Swahili does become kind of the primary language of these East African societies. And Swahili actually is kind of a lingua franca. It is a language spoken by the diverse group of merchants to communicate a lot easier, because Swahili is basically a mix between Arabic, the language of Muslim traders, but also Bantu. So we do see that generally across East Africa, we will see various kingdoms, various city-states emerge, and largely these city-states are going to emerge thanks to trade along the East African trade networks that blend into the Indian Ocean trade. So to capitalize on this trade, we see kingdoms and city-states form. But we also see within and across West Africa the diffusion of Arabic religion, Islam, but also Arabic as a language. We will see Muslim diasporic communities pop up along the East African coast. So many of these East African societies are going to have Islam as the basis of their political, cultural, and social formation of their society. So we do see that there is going to be a diffusion of Islam thanks to trade. We see the building of Islamic kingdoms across the East African coast. And these East African coastal communities largely are going to be engaged in trade with things like precious metals, like gold and copper. We also see the exchange of salt. Salt is very important. How are you going to preserve your meat? Salt. But also with ivory as well. We do see there is a demand for elephant ivory, especially. That's the probably best way you get ivory in Africa. I guess you can get ivory from walruses, but as far as I know, they don't exist in East Africa. But one kind of prominent example of a powerful kingdom that does exist in East Africa, in Southeast Africa, is going to be the city-state of Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe is going to be a major trading hub of Southeast Africa, and it is very much capitalizing on this rich community of trading with the Indian Ocean world, especially. So Great Zimbabwe, that's the capital of what is, basically the Zimbabwe Empire. It is this very complicated archaeological find. It was largely abandoned later on in Zimbabwe history, but it does have this very complex building structures that reflect the wealth, that reflect class hierarchies, that reflect religious ideas as well. So we do see that Great Zimbabwe is a major example of these city-states, of these civilizations based on trade that do emerge along the Swahili coast. And I would show this video in class. Who built Great Zimbabwe? It's very interesting, actually, because once we talk about European colonization, people are so dumbfounded by this monumental city ruins that all the kind of white colonizers, they're like, oh, Africans couldn't have built this. This was probably built by, I don't know, Christian or Islamic traders, but not native Africans themselves. But we're not going to watch that right now. Another society in East Africa that does emerge and is very culturally and religiously unique is going to be Ethiopia. And as you can see on those dates right here, the Ethiopia Empire, the Ethiopian kingdom, is very, very long lasting. It's going to actually even resist European colonization. And we'll talk about why that is a bit today, but more obviously later on. Let's look at Ethiopia because it is a very unique society in East Africa. Well, for one thing, it is going to have kind of its origins way back in the classical period with the kingdom of Axum. Axum is the name of this place. And Axum is important because it is kind of along classical trade networks. It's along the Roman connection to the Indian Ocean trade. And as such, it is going to have kind of contact with the classical world, especially with the spread of Christianity. And Axum actually is going to be one of the first states, the first countries, the first governments, I should say, to adopt Christianity as its official religion. Sorry, Armenia, we're talking about Africa right now. And eventually we do kind of see, because of this, a very rich cultural tradition emerge. There is going to be kind of a ruling family that will emerge in East Africa, in the region of what will become Ethiopia. They're called the Solomonic dynasty. And they're going to kind of base their origin story, you could say, off of Abrahamic tradition, especially with the so-called Queen of Bathsheba, who was married to King Solomon. So we do see kind of that a very distinct culture will emerge in Ethiopia, one that is blending together Judaism, Christianity, and local African traditions. However, we do see that it won't experience the same Christian developments as the rest of the Christian world, mostly because of its geographic isolation. For one thing, in the north of Ethiopia, you have Muslims who are largely going to cut off trade between Europe, between Christian Europe and Ethiopia, Christian Ethiopia. But it's also very difficult for Islamic empires to make a place significantly in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not going to be invaded by Islamic empires, mostly because it's way too mountainous. And that's going to be true also when we talk about European colonization. But because of this geographic isolation, because of its difficulty in being conquered, but also difficulty in being incorporated into overseas trade, we do see that a distinct religious identity will emerge in Ethiopia, one that basically combines kind of Judaism. There's a tradition that Jews fled into Ethiopia. And then there's also traditions of early Christianity that make their way into Ethiopian society. And all of this blends together to form what we refer to as Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. It is a branch of Christianity that arguably is a bit more closer to the original teachings of our boy Jesus, insofar as there is such cultural and linguistic isolation that does preserve these traditions from outside invaders. And you can see an example of syncretism, wee-oo, alarms going off right here. This is Mary, the mother of Jesus, with your homeboy Jesus right here. And it's an example of kind of the idea that Christianity will spread into places, that religions will spread into places, and they will take on their own unique flavor. Jesus right here, he's Ethiopian. Mary is Ethiopian in this example of a Christian icon. And we'll talk about more what that means with the Byzantines on Wednesday. Well, what is in my world Wednesday? But who knows? Who knows, future listener? So think about this question right here, and this is going to be our last question of this video. How did trade and migration influence the cultural and political identity of Sub-Saharan Africa? Thank you. Have a great day. Goodbye. My nose is itchy.